The security guard grabbed her arm at 6:47 a.m. and pulled her away from the hospital entrance while she was still holding her stomach with both hands. She was 9 months pregnant. She had been bleeding since 5 that morning. The reception nurse behind the glass did not look up from her computer as the guard walked the woman back through the automatic doors and set her down on the concrete outside like a bag someone had left on the wrong floor. The rain had not started yet, but the air smelled like it was coming. A blue plastic bag near her foot held everything she owned in Abuja. She did not cry. She did not argue. She looked once at the doors that had just closed on her, then lowered herself onto the low wall by the ambulance bay and pressed both palms flat against the belly that was carrying her son. She did not know that a man watching from a black SUV across the street had already lifted his phone and dialed a number no one at that hospital was allowed to ignore. Her name was Adaise Okafor. She was 29 years old and weighed 118 pounds because she had been skipping the evening meal for the last 4 months, so her mother, who lived with her in a single rented room in Kubwa, could eat something warm at night. She had walked to the hospital from the bus stop on Kubwa Expressway, 3 kilometers, because she did not have the 400 naira for the shuttle taxi, and she was afraid to spend the last 2,000 naira she was carrying inside the small brown envelope pinned to the inside of her dress. The dress itself was a faded green wrapper she had sewn herself from cloth her aunt sent from Onitsha 2 years ago. It was clean. She had washed it by hand the night before in a bucket behind the compound and hung it inside because there was no room on the line. Her shoes were rubber sandals from Woos Market that had cost her 300 naira in 2023 and had worn thin at the heel on the left side so that she walked with a slight tilt that no one who did not know her would notice. Inside the brown envelope, folded twice and pressed against her chest, was a photograph she had carried for 11 years. It was the only picture that existed of her father, taken at the naming ceremony of her younger brother in Enugu when she was 18. Her father was standing behind her mother, one hand on her shoulder, wearing a white agbada and a small smile that he almost never let anyone photograph. He had died 3 months after the picture was taken. She had not spoken his name aloud to another person in 9 years, because whenever she said it, something inside her chest shifted in a way she could not put back. But she carried the photograph everywhere. She had it with her at the hospital that morning, because she had woken up at 4 a.m. with a pain in her lower back that felt like something breaking loose, and she had put on her wrapper and pinned the envelope inside, because she believed, without saying it, that if she was going to die that day, she wanted her father's face to be near her when it happened. She had not come to the hospital to beg. She had come with a referral letter from a small clinic in Kubwa, signed by a midwife named Sister Grace, who had told her quietly that the baby was in a position that would not deliver on its own, and that she needed to go to a hospital that could operate. Sister Grace had written the letter on a piece of paper from a school exercise book and stamped it with the clinic's small round seal. Adaise had put the letter in the same envelope as the photograph and had walked to the bus stop before the sun came up. When she arrived at the reception at 6:23 a.m., she had handed the letter through the glass to the nurse behind the counter, a woman whose name tag said Blessing, and she had waited. Blessing had read the letter. She had looked at the wrapper. She had looked at the sandals. She had looked at the small brown envelope that Adaise had unpinned and held out. Then Blessing had said, without changing her tone, that the hospital did not accept clinic referrals from unregistered midwives, and that a surgical admission required a cash deposit of 150,000 naira before any file could be opened. Adaise had explained that she had 2,000 naira. She had explained that she was in labor. She had explained that Sister Grace had said the baby needed help. Blessing had reached for the intercom under the desk without looking up, and had said, "Security to reception," in the same tone a person might use to order a bottle of water. That was when the guard came, and that was how Adeze ended up on the concrete outside the doors of Federal Medical Center Abuja at 6:47 in the morning, with rain in the air, and a photograph of her dead father pressed against a belly that had begun to tighten in waves she could no longer count. Across the road, in the back seat of a black Toyota Land Cruiser parked under an almond tree, a man in his late 60s had been watching for 6 minutes. His name was Alhaji Ibrahim Danjuma. He was the chairman of a holding company that owned, among other things, the ground the hospital was built on. But no one at Federal Medical Center knew his face, because he had never once walked through the front entrance in the 14 years since the hospital had opened. He wore a plain white kaftan that had been ironed that morning by his driver. He was not wearing a watch. He was not wearing any jewelry. On the seat beside him was a small leather-bound book that he had been reading before he looked up and saw the guard walking a pregnant woman out of the doors of a hospital that his family's foundation had built. He had watched her sit down on the low wall. He had watched her not cry. He had watched her press her palms against her belly the way his wife had pressed her palms against her belly 41 years ago on the morning she had lost their first child in a hospital in Kaduna that had turned her away for the same reason. He had lifted his phone. He had dialed. He had said one sentence. Then he had told the driver to wait. Adeze did not know any of this. She was counting the seconds between the tightenings, and she was trying to remember what Sister Grace had told her about breathing. The rain began at 6:52 a.m. It was not a heavy rain at first. It was the kind of rain that came down in threads, the kind that made the concrete shine before it made anything wet. She pulled the edge of her wrapper up over her hair and leaned forward so that the envelope inside her dress would not get damp. A woman selling boiled eggs at the corner of the compound noticed her and walked over slowly. The woman was maybe 60 years old. She was wearing a long dark skirt and a headscarf and carrying a metal tray on her head balanced on a folded cloth. She set the tray down on the wall next to Adeze and looked at her. "Where is your husband?" the woman said. She did not phrase it as a question. Adeze did not answer for a long time. Then she said, quietly, "I don't have one." The woman nodded, as though this was information she had already assumed. She reached into a small cloth pouch tied at her waist and took out a boiled egg. She peeled it slowly with her fingers and handed it to Adeze without saying anything. Adeze took the egg. She had not eaten since noon the day before. She ate the egg in 3 bites and did not cry, but she did close her eyes for a moment, and the woman selling eggs watched her close them and understood something that Blessing at the reception had not understood and would not have understood if she had watched for an hour. The woman's name was Mama Nkechi. She had been selling boiled eggs outside the hospital gate for 11 years. She knew every nurse by name. She knew which doctors came in early and which ones came in late. She knew, because she had watched, that this was the 3rd woman that month who had been walked back through the doors by security after presenting a clinic referral. She had said nothing about the other 2. She was not going to say nothing about this one. Mama Nkechi picked up her tray and walked back toward the gate. She did not go to reception. She walked past the main entrance and around the side of the building to a smaller door near the pharmacy, and she knocked on it 3 times with the back of her hand. The door was opened by a young nurse named Ifeoma, who had been buying boiled eggs from Mama Nkechi every morning for 2 years. Mama Nkechi did not go inside. She said only, "There is a woman on the wall. She is bleeding. Her water is close." Then she picked up her tray and walked back to her corner. Ifeoma stood in the doorway for 4 seconds. Then she turned and walked back into the corridor with a speed that made two other nurses look up. By 7:04 a.m., the rain had thickened. Adeze had slid down from the low wall and was sitting on the concrete because sitting upright had become harder than sitting bent forward. The pain was now coming every 3 minutes and lasting longer than it was resting. She had put the photograph back inside the envelope and pinned it again to the inside of her wrapper. She was murmuring something under her breath that no one could hear. If you had been close enough, you would have heard that she was saying her father's name over and over, quietly, the way a person says a name when they are asking it to stay with them. Inside the hospital, in the corridor behind the pharmacy, 3 people were now moving toward the front entrance at once. Ifeoma was walking fast with a wheelchair. A senior midwife named Sister Constance had been informed and was walking behind her with a folded blanket. The chief medical officer, Dr. Obinna, had not been informed, because Blessing at reception was still at her desk and had not seen fit to inform anyone that the woman she had removed was still outside the doors of the hospital where she worked. Dr. Obinna would find out 4 minutes later, but by a route that no one in that building could have predicted. If this story is settling into you the way I think it is, subscribe now, because what happens in the next few minutes changes everything about the morning that Federal Medical Center thought was going to be ordinary. At 7:06 a.m., the door of the black Land Cruiser across the road opened, and Alhaji Ibrahim Danjuma stepped out into the rain. He did not open an umbrella. He walked across the wet asphalt slowly, because he was 68 years old and his knees were not what they had been. But he did not stop, and he did not look at the ground. He walked directly to the low wall where Adeze was sitting on the concrete with her arms around her belly, and he lowered himself down beside her, and he did not touch her, and he did not speak for a moment. He looked at her wrapper. He looked at the small stain of water spreading beneath her on the concrete. He looked at the envelope pinned inside her dress, the corner of which was visible where the fabric had shifted. Then he said, very quietly, "How long have you been on this floor?" Adeze looked at him for the first time. She saw a man in a white kaftan that had gotten wet across the shoulders. She saw the lines around his eyes. She did not know who he was. She said 20 minutes. He nodded. He turned and looked once at the doors of the hospital. Then he stood up, slowly, and walked to the entrance. And he did not walk fast, and he did not raise his voice, and he did not look back at her, and every single thing that happened in the next 11 minutes at Federal Medical Center Abuja was because of the sentence he was about to say. He walked through the automatic doors into the reception area. He walked past the row of plastic chairs where 2 men and a woman were waiting. He walked up to the glass counter where Blessing was still typing, and he stood in front of the glass for 4 seconds without speaking, and then he said, in the same quiet voice, "Bring the chief medical officer to this counter now." Blessing looked up. She saw an older man in a wet kaftan. She saw no watch, no jewelry, no visible signal of anything that would have made her act differently than she had acted with Adeze. She said, in the tone she had used all morning, "Sir, you need to take a ticket and sit down." He did not move. He said, again, without raising his voice, "Bring the chief medical officer to this counter now, or I will bring him myself." Something in the way he said the word myself made Blessing hesitate. She looked past him toward the doors, and she saw, for the first time, the black Land Cruiser parked across the road, and she saw the driver standing beside it in a dark suit. And she noticed, though she could not have said why she noticed, that the driver was watching the reception window. She picked up the phone. Dr. Obinna arrived in the reception area 90 seconds later, walking fast, still buttoning the second button of his white coat, because the message that had reached him had used a name he had heard once in a board meeting 3 years ago, and had never expected to hear at his front desk. He walked past the plastic chairs. He walked up to the counter. He looked at the man in the wet kaftan, and he stopped. And something in his face rearranged itself in a way that Blessing, who had worked at that reception for 6 years, had never seen his face do. "Doctor." Obinna took a small breath. He said, quietly, "Alhaji." The old man did not shake his hand. He turned his head slightly toward the doors and said, "There is a woman on your concrete. She has been in labor for 2 hours. Your reception refused her referral letter. Your security walked her outside. Move, doctor." Obinna moved. He moved so fast that his coat opened as he crossed the reception area, and by the time he was through the automatic doors, Ifeoma was already outside with the wheelchair, and Sister Constance was already crouched beside Adaeze with the folded blanket around her shoulders. And Mama Nkechi was standing at the corner of the compound with her tray on her head and her hand pressed against her mouth. They lifted Adaeze into the wheelchair. Sister Constance was the one who noticed the envelope pinned inside her wrapper, and she was the one who reached in gently and unpinned it and pressed it into Adaze's hand so that she would not lose it. Adaeze held the envelope against her chest with both hands as they rolled her through the doors that had, 45 minutes earlier, closed on her. Blessing was still standing behind the glass. She did not look up as they passed. She was looking at her hands, which were resting flat on the counter, and she was not moving them. Alhaji Ibrahim Danjuma walked back to the black Land Cruiser. He did not go into the hospital with them. He sat in the back seat, and he opened his small leather book, and he read for the next 4 hours, and every 20 minutes the driver stepped out of the car and walked to the reception window and asked, quietly, for an update. And every 20 minutes Ifeoma or Sister Constance walked out to the driver and told him where things were. At 11:34 a.m., Ifeoma came out and told the driver that the baby had been delivered by emergency cesarean section, and that the mother and the child were both alive. The driver walked back to the car and told the old man in the back seat. The old man closed his book. He sat very still for a moment. Then he said, "What did she name him?" The driver went back inside to ask. Ifeoma came out 15 minutes later and said the mother had not yet named the child because she was still asleep from the anesthesia, but that when she had been on the table before the surgery, she had said one name over and over, and the name had been her father's name. The driver came back to the car. He told the old man. The old man looked out through the window for a long time. Then he said, quietly, "What was the name?" The driver said, "Chukwuemeka." The old man closed his eyes. 41 years ago, in a hospital in Kaduna that had refused to admit his wife for the same reason Federal Medical Center had refused to admit Adaeze that morning, his wife had gone into labor in the back seat of a taxi and had lost their first child, a boy, before they could reach the second hospital. The boy had been born and had not lived, and his wife had held him for 14 minutes before she let the nurse take him. On the way home from the burial 3 days later, his wife had told him what she would have named the boy if the boy had lived, and the name she had said was Chukwuemeka, which was her father's name, and which she had never spoken again to anyone in the 41 years that followed. She had died 6 years ago without ever having another child, and Alhaji Ibrahim Danjuma had built the hospital foundation and funded 3 maternity wings, and quietly bought the ground that Federal Medical Center was built on, and had never once told anyone, not even the members of his own board, why he had done any of it. He sat in the back of the Land Cruiser at 11:51 a.m. And he did not cry, but he pressed the leather-bound book flat against his chest with both hands, and he stayed like that for a long time, and the driver did not say anything, because the driver had been with him for 19 years and knew when not to speak. At 2:15 p.m., Adese woke up in a private recovery room on the 3rd floor of the hospital. Sister Constance was sitting beside the bed. On a small table next to her was the envelope with the photograph inside it. Unopened, unwrinkled, dried carefully with a soft cloth. In the crib next to the bed was her son. He was 7 pounds and 2 ounces. He was sleeping. Sister Constance told her that the surgery had gone well. She told her that the hospital had waived every fee. She told her that the chairman of the foundation that owned the hospital had personally paid for a private room for 2 weeks and had arranged for a car to take her and the baby home to Coubois when she was ready, and that a monthly stipend for the baby's care would be transferred into an account that would be opened in her name the following morning. Adese did not understand most of what Sister Constance was telling her. She said, quietly, "Who is he?" Sister Constance said, "He asked me not to tell you." Adese looked at the crib. She reached for the envelope on the small table and pressed it against her chest. She said, "Can I thank him?" Sister Constance said, "He said the only thing he wants is to know what you named the child." Adese looked at her son. She had already told the anesthesiologist. She said it again now, so that Sister Constance could carry it back. "Chukwemeka, after my father." Sister Constance nodded. She stood up. She walked out of the room. 10 minutes later, in the back of a black Land Cruiser under an almond tree across the road, an old man in a white kaftan heard the name spoken a second time that day, and he did something he had not done since the funeral of his wife. He put both hands over his face, and he wept, quietly, without moving his shoulders, the way a man weeps when he has been carrying something for 41 years and has finally been allowed to set it down. Dr. Obina returned to reception at 3 p.m. Blessing was still at her desk. He did not speak to her that day. He wrote a memo that night. By the end of the week, every reception nurse at Federal Medical Center had been enrolled in a mandatory retraining program on emergency admissions, and the first module of that program was designed and paid for by a foundation whose name none of them recognized. Blessing was reassigned to the records office on the 4th floor, where she would work for the next 2 years, filing paper documents into cabinets, and thinking, every morning when she walked past the reception glass, about a woman in a green wrapper who had held out a small brown envelope and said, quietly, "But I am in labor." The clinic referral system that Sister Grace had used, which had been informal and unfunded for 6 years, was formally recognized by the hospital in a written policy that went into effect on the first day of the following month. Sister Grace was invited to the hospital to help design the recognition process. She wore her best dress. She did not know who had funded the policy. Alhaji Ibrahim Danjuma never once visited Adese in her recovery room. He watched from the Land Cruiser on the morning she was discharged. He watched the driver hand her the paperwork for the account that had been opened in her name. He watched her carry her son out through the same automatic doors that had closed on her 12 days earlier, and this time no one at reception looked away. This time, Ifeoma was standing at the counter, and she smiled, and Adese smiled back, though she did not fully understand why she was smiling. She walked out into the sunlight, holding her son against her chest with one arm and the small brown envelope in her other hand. Then she got into the car, and the car drove her home to Coubois, and the driver carried her bags up the 3 flights of stairs to the single rented room where her mother was waiting, and her mother, who had not known if she would ever see her daughter alive again, held both of them and did not let go for a long time. Adese never learned who the old man in the wet kaftan was. She asked, sometimes, in the years that followed. Sister Constance, whom she visited every year on the boy's birthday, would only say, "He asked me not to tell you." Mama Nkechi, whom she went to see on her way home from that first hospital visit, would only say, "Some people the world is not ready to name. Let him keep his silence." Adeze accepted this. She raised her son. She went back to school. She trained as a midwife because she remembered Sister Grace, and she remembered Sister Constance. And she remembered what it had felt like to be sitting on that concrete, with rain in the air and no one looking. By the time her son turned 12, she was working at a small maternity clinic in Kubwa, and every referral letter she wrote was on official paper, and every referral letter she wrote was accepted at Federal Medical Center without question. Because a policy that had been written 12 years earlier by a memo she had never read had made her signature carry a weight she did not know it carried. Alhaji Ibrahim Danjuma lived for another 9 years. He died in his sleep in his home in Maitama at the age of 77. He left no children of his own. His will, which was read to a small group of foundation trustees in a boardroom in Abuja, included a single unusual clause. It set aside a scholarship fund in the name of a boy called Chukwemeka Okafor to cover the boy's education from secondary school through university and any professional training he chose to pursue thereafter. The trustees did not know who the boy was. The lawyer did not explain. The clause was executed. Adeze received the letter 3 weeks after the funeral, and she read it twice. And then she sat down on the edge of her bed and pressed her hand flat against her chest, where the envelope had once been pinned. And she understood, for the first time in 9 years, who the old man in the wet kaftan had been. Blessing at the reception desk thought she was doing her job that morning. She thought she was following the policy. She looked at a wrapper and a pair of worn sandals and a small brown envelope with 2,000 naira inside. And she made a decision about the woman holding them that took her less than 4 seconds. And that decision cost her the career she had spent 6 years building. But the truth is that Adeze did not walk into that hospital carrying only 2,000 naira. She walked in carrying a name that had been spoken in another hospital 41 years earlier by a woman who had held her dying son for 14 minutes and had never said his name aloud again. She walked in carrying the reason a foundation had been built, the reason a hospital existed at all, the reason an old man in a plain white kaftan happened to be sitting in a car across the road at 6:47 in the morning on the one day when her life required him to be there. She did not know she was carrying it. Neither did he, until he heard the name. And that is the thing the world keeps forgetting. You cannot tell, by looking, what a person is carrying. You cannot know, by their clothes or their sandals or the size of the envelope in their hand, what history is folded inside it. You cannot know whose grief they are about to answer, or whose 41 years' silence they are about to break, or whose foundation they are about to become. The people the world walks past on the concrete are often the ones the world was built for, and did not know it. And the morning that blessing turned her away, she was not turning away a poor woman with a referral letter. She was turning away the answer to a prayer that an old man in a black Land Cruiser had not known he was still praying. If you were the old man in that car, and you saw the woman on the concrete, and you did not yet know whose name she was carrying inside her dress, would you have crossed the road? Or would you have driven past, the way most of us drive past, and told yourself that someone else would help? Leave your answer in the comments. I really want to read it. Subscribe for more stories about hidden strength, quiet power, and the people the world overlooks until they change everything. I'll see you in the next one.